Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week we conclude some business inside the Lonely Mountain with the end of Chapter 12, Inside Information, before moving on to Chapter 13 of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, Not at Home, in which Bilbo discovers a pretty important gem. The dwarves get a major gear up. They finally get to armor up. And then we head out to Ravenhill to find out where Smaug went. It's a really interesting interlude because it contrasts so effectively with some of the interludes that we've discussed previously, right? I've talked before about the kind of rescue or escape structure that we've seen throughout the structure of The Hobbit, that Thorin and Company get into trouble and then are released somehow from the confines of that conflict and find themselves in a place of space and plenty. It's not quite as severe as the similar sawtooth structure that we see at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, but it is still emblematic of Bilbo's quest to the east, right? It is still the repeated structure that gives this story its picaresque feeling as we move through. But here we get something that is very different. Here we get a chapter that is downbeat, yes, that is in some sense a release from the tension of the preceding chapter, but here it is played all for ominous, doom-filled prediction of what is to come. It is all foreshadowing in the best way, and this is a chapter, I have to say, that really has kind of unlocked itself for me in this reading. I really enjoyed moving through this chapter today and taking my notes. So we'll see where the conversation leads us in the course of the next hour. Good evening to Chris and to Austin and to Hugh. Good morning, of course, to Hugh. Thank you guys so much for joining me here this evening. This is going to be, I think, a fun one. Quick scheduling note before we get into the content of tonight's episode. I'm not going to be hosting the Live at the Green Dragon after show tonight because the minute that this podcast is concluded, I'm literally like alt-tabbing over to a bunch of windows that I have already open on my broadcast computer here so that I can release the other Shire Reckoning episode. So the Shire Reckoning episode that was supposed to come out earlier today will be coming out immediately after this podcast is concluded. And then the podcast recorded version of this episode will go out tomorrow morning, probably as usual. So lots and lots and lots and lots of Shire Reckoning heading your way in the next 24 hours. The other episode this week is a Q&A episode, which is super fun. The reason it was delayed just a little bit is that I wanted to do just a scotch more research before I sat down to record. And it's a ton of fun. With all that said, then, let's get into it. I suppose I want to talk... Well, no, I wanted to talk about the chapter title for Not at Home, but I don't want to talk about that yet because we do, as I say, have to compensate for my heart out last week by finishing up our discussion of Inside Information. We have 2 quick slides to get to in that. So let's begin then with Bilbo fleeing down fleeing up, I suppose, the passageway back to the mountainside where the dwarves tend to his minor burns, his singed hair. Bilbo, in a fit of pique, no less, I should say, than a fit of pique, throws a stone at a thrush, and Thorin chastises him. Then they talk about the treasure hoard, and the dwarves are caught up in memory, in the power of stories. We see even then the exact nature of this relationship, of course, is so important, but let us say, at the very least, the profoundly emotional and personal connection that the dwarves, whether they have lived themselves in Erebor or not, and we should remember that only Thorin and Balin ever lived in Erebor. All of the other dwarves are younger than the 171 years that have passed since Smaug took the Lonely Mountain. So there is a cultural element to their association with the Horde, but there also seems to be something more than that. There seems to be something quintessentially dwarvish about that. We'll talk a little more about, as we just seem to be doing every week now. We're going to talk a little more about some slightly uncomfortable thoughts on dwarves later in tonight's session. And this is the moment, of course, when Thorin really foreshadows the singular artifact, which will be so important to the end of our story. Let's switch over now to the slide so that we can discuss the Arkenstone. The Arkenstone. The Arkenstone, murmured Thorin in the dark, half dreaming with his chin upon his knees. It was like a globe with 1,000 facets. It shone like silver in the firelight, like water in the sun, like snow under the stars, like rain upon the moon. But the enchanted desire of the Horde had fallen from Bilbo. All through their talk, he was only half listening to them. He sat nearest to the door with one ear cocked for any beginnings of a sound without. His other was alert for echoes beyond the murmurs of the dwarves, for any whisper of a movement from far below. So I'll put a pin in the discussion of the Arkenstone proper until later when we get a physical description of the gem, when Bilbo actually well, both encounters it and takes it for his own. But it is important that we are foreshadowing here. It is important that we are setting it up as, even in the midst of this peculiar reverie which the dwarves are consumed with in this moment, even here we are foreshadowing the importance, the specific importance of the Arkenstone itself. The name Arkenstone, of course, somewhat famously, I believe that this, discussions of the Arkenstone are maybe second only to discussions of whether or not Balrogs have wings in terms of how frequent and how passionate they are in the Tolkien fandom. So forgive me if I'm kind of assuming that we've been over this ground before, because it sure feels like I personally have been over this ground many, many times. But the name Arkenstone is taken from the Anglo-Saxon Eorklanstan, which is translated into English as precious stone. There is also a connection to the Old High German, which gives us which gives us the word Earknis. I'm not entirely sure how we parse that, which means holy, right? We are getting a sense that there is something more than just preciousness here in terms of the role, the purpose, the function of the Arkenstone itself. Again, more on this later when we encounter it for real. The dwarves then flee into the tunnel. We have the moment of attack, right? The dwarves, which of course Bilbo too is foreshadowing here. He is the one that is less seduced by the lure of the horde. Whatever. Again, I want to hesitate before I attach words like magic or power to this particular effect, but whatever it is that is enchanting the dwarves, so Bilbo is not so susceptible to it here. There is a kind of a fusion here, I think, of his Baggins and Took sides. There is both sides of Bilbo Baggins are united in their regard for the dragon more than the treasure. Right? They are paying attention to the immediate threat, whether this is the discomfort being felt by the Baggins side or the, I guess, more heroic aspect of the Tookish side of Bilbo's nature. In any case, Smaug attacks. The dwarves flee into the tunnel. They close the door mere moments before Smaug smites the side of the mountain, sealing them inside. But Smaug is not finished, and this is the slide with which we will conclude chapter 12 of The Hobbit. Smaug had left his lair in silent stealth, quietly soared into the air, and then floated heavy and slow in the dark like a monstrous crow down the wind toward the west of the mountain, in the hopes of catching unawares something or somebody there, and of spying the outlet to the passage which the thief had used. This was the outburst of his wrath, when he could find nobody and see nothing, even when he guessed the outlet must actually be. After he had let off his rage in this way, he felt better, and he thought in his heart that he would not be troubled again from that direction. In the meanwhile, he had further vengeance to take. "Barrel rider," he snorted, "your feet came from the waterside, and up the water you came without a doubt. I don't know your smell, but if you are not one of those men of the lake, you had their help. They shall see me and remember who is the real king under the mountain." He rose in fire and went away south toward the running river. So here we see, right, again, as we discussed in last week's episode, a really interesting shift in our perspective, a pivot in our perspective here, out and away from the mountain, not just giving us the actuality of Smaug, not just giving us the physical being of Smaug, but his personality, even his thought process. Though I find it so interesting. He felt better, and he thought in his heart that he would not be troubled again from that direction. Even here, for all that Smaug is fierce in his intellect, right? His overwhelming power of personality is such that it can daunt, we discussed this a little, I think, with regard to Glaurung last week, but he has this immense and powerful personality. But still there is this moment of animalism, of animalishness, I suppose, here. Tolkien's kind of still anchoring his emotional response anchoring his emotional response in his emotional response, right? How tautological can you get? You can get that tautological, which is, in of course, itself a tautological. There is an idea here that we are setting aside rationality. There is an idea here that Smaug is still a beast, that there is something driving him that is emotional, that is not necessarily irrational, but maybe irrational would be the better way of putting it, right? Brian is joining us here. Good to have you here, Brian. You haven't missed much. We've just been, talking about the Arkenstone and getting ready for our descent into the very roots of the mountain. Hugh says Smaug has a heart, lol. Well, biologically perhaps. Well, actually, that's not fair, right? The text here is explicitly kind of giving us that idea that there is an emotional aspect to Smaug. I'm going to, I was going to say put a pin in this. I'm not sure there's a pin large enough to hold this topic. The nature of dragons has been very much on my mind after the Tom Bombadil episode, where I was talking so much about the incarnate spirits of Arda and their both dubious aspect and dubious origin, right? This open question as to the origin point of, for example, the dark spirit that is animating, the evil spirit, forgive me, that is animating Glaurung, right? The first and the prototype dragon of the first age. I've just been thinking so much about where these spirits come from and how we are to understand them. So I don't necessarily want to go too far down that road, but it is interesting. It is always interesting to return to Smaug and to see the most fully realized dragon that we get still be so elusive, still be so ambiguous, and still pay so much reference to those kinds of poems and tales that inspired Tolkien in this particular direction, right? He fuses so many different traditions in his pursuit of his secondary world. There are so many different roots to the tree that becomes Arda, the tree that becomes Middle-earth, the tree that becomes the Legendarium. But one of the most powerful is the Anglo-Saxon saga. It is the Beowulf. It is the Kalevala for a certain degree, right? All of these inspirations are so powerful. And the dragons seem to be very much a part of that, rather than the more Arthurian, chivalric, medieval kind of inspirations upon which Tolkien draws. Let's get to, then, I think our discussion of Not at Home, right? Oh no, Brian's saying, is it just me or is anyone else getting intermittent distorted audio? I sure hope not. Everything looks clean here, Brian. I apologize. Possibly just a simple refresh will fix it, which is, of course, our panacea for internet troubles. He was saying that everything seems to be working fine, so I hope that everything works out. Okay, good. Unfortunately, Brian, it seems to be just you, which I say only with a modicum of relief that it isn't me, but this is where we are, nonetheless. Okay, let's get into our discussion then of Chapter 13 of Not at Home by talking about the despair, and there's a loaded word if ever there was one, of the dwarves. In the meanwhile, the dwarves sat in darkness, and utter silence fell about them. Little they ate, and little they spoke. They could not count the passing of time, and they scarcely dared to move, for the whisper of their voices echoed and rustled in the tunnel. If they dozed, they woke still to darkness and to silence going on unbroken. At last, after days and days of waiting, as it seemed, when they were becoming choked and dazed for want of air, they could bear it no longer. They would almost have welcomed sounds from below of the dragon's return. In the silence, they feared some cunning devilry of his, but they could not sit there forever. Thorin spoke. "Let us try the door," he said. "I must feel the wind on my face soon or die. I think I would rather be smashed by Smaug in the open than suffocate in here." So several of the dwarves got up and groped back to where the door had been, but they found that the upper end of the tunnel had been shattered and blocked with broken rock. Neither key nor the magic it had once obeyed would ever open that door again. "We're trapped," they groaned. "This is the end. We shall die here." So I wanted to introduce this topic by talking about the chapter title. No one here is at home. Obviously, Smaug is not at home, right? That's the most kind of literal, superficial, face value kind of reading of the title of the chapter. But more profoundly, Thorin and Company are not at home. Bilbo, of course, very directly, very specifically, is not at home. But this is the Lonely Mountain as it's positioned as being Smaug's home, despite the fact that Thorin and the other dwarves have this claim on the treasure, right? It is the treasure more than the fabric of the place. Well, we'll talk a little more about that when we get to it. But I love the setting here of the dwarves having finally accomplished their goal for a given value of their goal. They find themselves despairing. And of course, as I say, despair is a very loaded word, but it doesn't seem to carry the same mythic connotation here that we get later in The Lord of the Rings, right? For those who see the end beyond all doubt, as Gandalf tells us. That is what despair is for, right? We think of the despair on the Pelennor field when Theoden falls. We think about despair being the very last spark of life and hope and defiance before the darkness claims us. And this is, well, certainly something like that, but we're still slightly in this fairy tale mode. We're going to be able to talk next week, I want to say. Yes. Next week we'll be able to cover most of it. We'll be able to talk about the final phase of the fairy tale of The Hobbit and witness its passing as it is completely eclipsed by the fantasy story that this book has been becoming through the course of these many chapters. But the despair here, I think, is still belonging more to the fairy tale tradition than it is to what we get from The Lord of the Rings much later. So here we are in this timeless darkness. This is one of the ways in which, of course, it is kind of fairy tale, right? We have this absence of the sense of the passing of time. It is otherworldly. They are cocooned in darkness and in silence, going on unbroken, as we're told. At last, after days and days of waiting, as it seemed, turns out, of course, it will not be days and days of waiting. It will be 2 days, 1 night that they spent here, which is not an inconsiderable amount of time, of course, but still. We're getting this sense that time itself is malleable here as they wait. And then finally, there is the desire for action. Finally, the need of the dwarves, the need of Thorin in particular, who seems to be back in command once again, drives action here. And this will carry us to, well, as I say, as Thorin takes action, we pivot away to Bilbo taking action, right? In the absence of escape from the end of the tunnel, back out onto the mountainside, well, this is the job for our burglar, of course. But somehow, just when the dwarves were most despairing, Bilbo felt a strange lightening of the heart, as if a heavy weight was gone from under his waistcoat. Come, he said. While there's life, there's hope, as my father used to say, and third time pays for all. I'm going down the tunnel once again. I have been that way twice when I knew there was a dragon at the other end, so I will risk a third visit when I am no longer sure. Anyway, the only way out is down, and I think this time you had better all come with me. In desperation, they agreed, and Thorin was the first to go forward by Bilbo's side. Now, do be careful, whispered the Hobbit, and be as quiet as you can be. There may be no Smaug at the bottom, but then again there may be. Don't let us take any unnecessary risks. Here, again, we can see the combination, the fusion of Bilbo's Baggins side and Took side. Here, the Tookish adventurer says, look, we've been here before. I, at least, have been here before. There is no alternative but to face this challenge and to overcome it. Bravery is our best and wisest course at this point. However, says the Baggins side, let's not force anyone's hand. Let's not behave unwisely. Let's not behave foolishly. Let us not take any unnecessary risks. There's the direct echo here, of course, for third time pays for all. Bilbo said this in Inside Information, as we discussed last week. Last time it was in reference to saving the dwarves for a third time, a theoretical third time. After the spiders and the elves, now he has to go and face the dragon alone. Now it's referring to this third trip down the tunnel into the chamber at the root of the mountain. But what's more interesting, I think, here is the way that it is balanced with this phrase, where there is life, there is hope, which is repeated by Sam Gamgee in the pages of The Lord of the Rings. Chapter 7, Book 4, Journey to the Crossroads, we get this moment of detonation, right? We get the terrible release of energy and smoke from Mount Doom. This is the quote. At that moment, a rolling and rumbling noise was heard again, louder now and deeper. The ground seemed to quiver under their feet. I think we're in for trouble anyhow, said Frodo. I'm afraid our journey is drawing to an end. Maybe, said Sam, but where there's life, there's hope, as my gaffer used to say, and need of victuals, as he most ways used to add. You have a bite, Mr. Frodo, and then a bit of sleep. End quote. So there again, right, we get Sam there embodying also the kind of best Baggins-ish and Tookish aspects of hobbitry in general, the adventurous and the, well, if not cautious, then at least the kind of domestic side of hobbits. So it is possible that this is a Tolkien original, but it is drawn, I think, at least in sentiment, from Ecclesiastes 9:4, which is given in the King James translation as, quote, for to him that is joined to all the living there is hope, end quote, while the New International Bible has it as, quote, anyone who is among the living has hope. What I find most interesting about this is that there are some very cool, modern, accessible, for the teens translations of the Bible that actually render Ecclesiastes 9:4 as while there's life, there's hope, kind of giving us a possibly very pleasing circular trail of inspiration and derivation there in a way that I really appreciate. And of course, it's well, I don't know. I guess we kind of talked about this as we started to do it, which, gosh, was that only last week? I feel like we've been talking in absentia about Bungo Baggins now for several weeks, but it is so interesting to see how present Bungo is in this phase of the adventure, how all these old quotes are coming back to Bilbo's mind, how all of these little aphoristic turns of phrase are being rendered now. While there's life, there's hope, as my father used to say, and third time pays for all. I'm going down the tunnel once again. And you'll note that Thorin is the first to go forward by Bilbo's side, which could have had that played out all the way to the end, without interruption, by Bilbo falling into the cavern, could have completely changed the path of the book, of course. We'll talk about that in just a moment. In fact, we'll talk about it, I guess, right now as we discuss Bilbo falling, discovering that Smaug is gone, calling for light, and then going off exploring on his own, which leads him to the Arkenstone. They saw the little dark shape of the hobbit start across the floor, holding his tiny light aloft. Every now and again, while he was still near enough, they caught a glint and a tinkle as he stumbled on some golden thing. The light grew smaller as he wandered away into the vast hall. Then it began to rise, dancing into the air. Bilbo was climbing the great mound of treasure. Soon he stood upon the top and still went on. Then they saw him halt and stop for a moment, but they did not know the reason. It was the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain. So Bilbo guessed from Thorin's description, but indeed there could not be two such gems, even in so marvelous a hoard, even in all the world. Ever as he climbed, the same white gleam had shone before him and drawn his feet toward it. Slowly it grew to a little globe of pallid light. Now as he came near, it was tinged with a flickering sparkle of many colors at the surface, reflected and splintered from the wavering light of his torch. At last he looked down upon it, and he caught his breath. The great jewel shone before his feet of its own inner light, and yet, cut and fashioned by the dwarves who had dug it from the heart of the mountain long ago, it took all light that fell upon it and changed it into 10,000 sparks of white radiance, shot with glints of the rainbow. Suddenly Bilbo's arm went towards it, drawn by its enchantment. His small hand would not close about it, for it was a large and heavy gem, but he lifted it, shut his eyes, and put it in his deepest pocket. Now I'm a burglar indeed, thought he. But I suppose I must tell the dwarves about it. Sometime. They did say I could pick and choose my own share, and I think I would choose this if they took all the rest. All the same, he had an uncomfortable feeling, for the picking and choosing had not really been meant to include this marvelous gem, and the trouble that would yet come of it. He was asking here in the chat, I've always wondered ever since I was 10, why did he take it? I think to address that directly, we kind of have to talk about this question of its Silmarility, right? its similarity to the Silmarils, if you will. We've talked a little about this before, and Tolkien's use of the word Eorclunstana, right? This is derived from his translation of some of the foundational texts of the Legendarium into Old English, which is exactly the kind of thing that the professor would do during a long summer holiday. He translates these stories into Old English, and the word that he uses to mean the Silmarils, to refer to the Silmarils, is Eorclunstana, right? The same word that is the root of the word Arkenstone itself. So basically, from the point that the Silmarillion was released, I suppose, right? There really was no way otherwise to know about this. But from the point of the release of the Silmarillion, people have been wondering if the Arkenstone is a Silmaril, particularly the one, thrown by Mithros into the bowels of the earth, supposedly here recovered, dug up once more by the dwarves of Erebor. And yes, we're getting kind of all of the answers here in the chat already, which I really love. Austin saying it is a Silmaril borrowed for a book that isn't part of the Legendarium. I think that this is basically it, right? This is the conclusion that I come to as well, Austin, that this is Tolkien engaging in that auto-plagiaristic impulse that we've noted before. He draws on, he ransacks elements of his own stories for The Hobbit, because The Hobbit is never supposed to be a part of the Legendarium. The Arkenstone is never supposed to exist in the same universe as the Silmarils, so he takes some of that same sense impression that we get from the Silmarils in the Silmarillion and the roots of the Legendarium and uses it again here. It's exactly the same as Elrond and the stories of Gondolin, right? He loots and ransacks his earlier stories for shiny baubles that he can use to bedeck The Hobbit, and of course it is absolutely his right to do so. He's drawing upon his own stories, partly, mostly, honestly, for his own entertainment, right? Particularly during the earliest phases of composition. He doesn't really have an expectation that the Silmarillion is ever going to see the light of day, but the publication of The Hobbit seems quite likely indeed. So he's kind of reusing the same idea. Now, when we situate The Hobbit in the Legendarium, is the Arkenstone a Silmaril? And the answer is kind of inescapably not. It is different, right? We have, of course, the usual textual evidence. We have several letters written by Professor Tolkien very clearly declaiming that the only Silmaril that is still like extant in the world is the Silmaril of Eärendil, and the one that was cast into the waters and the one that was cast into the earth are lost until the end of the world, right? We're just being very, very blunt about this here. But that doesn't escape the reflection, the symmetry here. It rhymes, to borrow a particular turn of phrase. It is similar, and in that similarity, right? Chris is calling out here in response to Hugh's question, right? I think he was temporarily overcome by the dragon sickness, which I think is exactly, which I think is inexactly what we're talking about here. It's certainly compatible with what we're talking about here, right? The Silmarils, objects of great power in general, objects of magical influence, objects which are just unusually beautiful, do exert an attractive influence in Tolkien's work. This seems to be just a natural product of their unique and particular beauty, right? This is true of the Silmarils. It's true of the Ring. It's true of several, different. The Nauglimian, I think we can think of back when we're talking about the Silmarillion. Certainly, Feanor is attracted to, the strands of Galadriel's hair, which also seem to embody the light of Telperion and Laurelin. But there's something consistent in how we approach treasure in general and how we approach these particular artifacts that suggests that there is something which moves the heart to acquisition. Now, are we supposed to see this as a moment of weakness from Bilbo or a moment of strength from Bilbo, right? Are we comparing him to his better self, or are we urged here to compare him to the dwarves, as they themselves will be so consumed by their delight in the Horde when they descend into the cavern in just a few moments' time? They are going to demonstrate much less restraint than we get from Bilbo here, because even in this moment, right, you can see how we separate it out here, how we filter it out. Suddenly Bilbo's arm went toward it, drawn by its enchantment. So very clearly, right, there is a magic upon this thing that makes you want it. So his arm, as distinct from Bilbo's conscious mind, extends towards it. His small hand would not close about it, for it was large and a heavy gem, but he lifted it, shut his eyes, and put it in his deepest pocket. Now I read that moment of shutting his eyes to be a kind of denial of the responsibility that he is taking here to steal this thing. And then he begins to narrativize in exactly the way as people narrativize under the influence of the ring, which I find so peculiar here because, of course, Bilbo has the ring in his pocket. And I know that the ring does not exert this influence in the pages of The Hobbit, because the ring in The Hobbit is not yet the One Ring, not even after multiple revisions. It still doesn't behave as the ring behaves in The Lord of the Rings. But there is this consonance here. We see the same kinds of effects. And these kinds of effects, I think, can be associated. The other objects of power that seem to exhibit a similar attraction and a similar narrativizing impulse in the wielder, the user, the owner, right, are the Palantiri, of course. We kind of see something similar to this, from both Saruman and Denethor in The Lord of the Rings. So these objects of great power do exert this influence. But here, Bilbo is, it seems to me, taking a very hobbitish approach. He's denying it. He's resisting it for as long as he can. And when he can't resist it fully, he is narrativizing it. And even then, the narrative voice intrudes to reassure us that he's not convinced by it, right? I think I would choose this if they took all the rest. All the same, he had an uncomfortable feeling that the picking and choosing had not really been meant to include this marvelous gem, which he hadn't heard word one about until the preceding chapter, right? It isn't until inside information that Thorin brings this stone up in the first place. But as Brian's calling out here in the chat, for primarily narrative reasons, so Bilbo can give it to the elves/man later on. Spoilers. Yes, it is more so, I think, than any of the objects of power that we associate with Professor Tolkien. I think that the functional narrative use of the Arkenstone here is just brilliant. It is so straightforward. And of course, this comes into the story around the time of the most substantial revision to the end of the book, right? As Tolkien is finally setting aside the idea that Bilbo Baggins is going to be the one to kill Smaug, he introduces this other chapter because he needs a dragon slayer. He needs bards. So he starts to revise all of these structures and starts to backfill motivation for all of those characters. And the Arkenstone lies at the very heart of that. So to kind of conclude that thought, is the Arkenstone a Silmaril? No, but it sure looks like one, and it sure feels like one, and it sure behaves like one, because it is kind of a a photocopy of what the Silmarils are intended to be at that point in the composition process. Okay, let's get to our we have this encounter with the bat, right? We have, oh no, I wanted to call out, let me call the slide back up. Here we go. Just a opportunity here to observe a really brilliant kind of visual effect that we get right there in that first paragraph, right? The little dark shape of the hobbit started across the floor, holding his tiny light aloft. Every now and again, while he was still near enough, they caught a glint and a tinkle as he stumbled on some golden thing. The light grew smaller as he wandered away into the vast hall. Then it began to rise, dancing into the air. I love the image there that across this truly vast hall, shrouded in this darkness, the pinpoint of light that is Bilbo, that is the pine torch that he is holding here, seems to ascend in the darkness. And we can infer, the dwarves infer, that he is climbing the great mound of treasure. But nonetheless, it is an ascension. And I hadn't ever thought about the mound of treasure here being representative of both. We've called attention before to, the hill in the west and the mountain in the east, and these being the furthest extents of the spectrum which encompasses Bilbo's entire journey. But there is something here, I think, about the mound of treasure, sans Smaug, representing or being reflective of both hill and mountain right in this moment. So, we can start to think about hill, mountain, and mound, if you like, as a more complicated indexical structure, I suppose. I'm thinking of the ways in which they are behaving metonymically as representatives of each other, right? The dwarves are certainly going to feel this in the very next slide. We're going to have the dwarves descend to the treasure and behave as though the reclaiming of the treasure is the reclaiming of the mountain. And the narrative voice is very emphatically going to draw that difference, right? It is going to emphasize how distinct the mound and the mountain really are. But of course, if we're talking about the mountain, we're folding in ideas of the hill too, all the way to the west, particularly as we might argue, Bilbo is engaging in the same kind of rationalizing operation, right? He's having the same response to the treasure here, albeit in a microcosmic scale. He takes the Arkenstone, which, yes, is the most expensive and special and wonderful thing in the entire hoard, but is still a single gemstone that he can fit in his pocket. And that seems to him to be representative of his successful fulfillment of the contract, right? I don't think it's a coincidence that at that point he doesn't just think, I want this. He thinks, this is the reward I was promised. This is the reward that was defined in the contract as it was laid out back home. I think there is an echo there of something more familiar for Bilbo. Let's get on then to the dwarves and the treasure, and a faintly ridiculous part of the book. Glowin lit several more torches, and they all crept out one by one and went along the wall as hurriedly as they could. It was not long before they met Bilbo himself coming back toward them. His wits had quickly returned as soon as he saw the twinkle of their lights. "Only a bat and a dropped torch, nothing worse," he said in answer to their questions. Though they were much relieved, they were inclined to be grumpy at being frightened for nothing. But what they would have said if he had told them at that moment about the Arkenstone, I don't know. The mere fleeting glimpses of treasure which they had caught as they went along had rekindled all the fire of their dwarvish hearts, and when the heart of a dwarf, even the most respectable, is awakened by gold and by jewels, he grows suddenly bold, and he may become fierce. The dwarves indeed no longer needed any urging. All were now eager to explore the hall while they had the chance, and willing to believe that for the present Smaug was away from home. Each now gripped a lighted torch, and as they gazed first on one side and then another, they forgot fear and even caution. They spoke aloud and cried out to one another as they lifted old treasures from the mound or from the wall and held them in the light, caressing and fingering them. Fili and Kili were almost in a merry mood, and finding still hanging there many golden harps strung with silver, they took them and struck them, and being magical and also untouched by the dragon, who had small interest in music, they were still in tune. The dark hall was filled with a melody that had long been silent. But most of the dwarves were more practical. They gathered gems and stuffed their pockets, and let what they could not carry fall back through their fingers with a sigh. Thorin was not least among these, but always he searched from side to side for something which he could not find. It was the Arkenstone, but he spoke of it yet to no one. This is, of course, in the aftermath of Bilbo's encounter with the bat and the dropping of his torch. A very kind of low-key emergency situation here for Bilbo, but one which nonetheless really manages to drive home how alien this environment is for him. And of course, I'm drawing all of these like high-minded thematic connections between between Bag and Erebor itself as it's presented to us here. But of course, we don't have to go that far, right? In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Well, he's in a hole in the ground, but this is very unlike his home. Bilbo, too, as I said earlier, not at home. We're obviously going to have to talk a little about this depiction of dwarves. Well, the one thing that I want to note here that I think is most important in terms of our understanding of what Tolkien really holds to be true of dwarves and how he has depicted them in the course of this book is the best way of putting this would be the draconic language and imagery that is being presented to us here, right? It is no coincidence, I think, that the ways in which the dwarves are rejuvenated, are restored, are roused by the sight of the treasure, that these words are Smaug adjacent or Smaug compatible words, right? They had rekindled all the fire of their dwarvish hearts. And when the heart of the dwarf, even the most respectable, is wakened by, you'll remember Smaug sleeping before, right? Is wakened by gold and by jewels, he grows suddenly bold and he may become fierce. There is draconic imagery here, and the dwarf, which of course ties to our understanding of the dragon sickness and of the influence of the treasure. And as we move through this discussion, the narrative remains, I think, very restrained. We're going to have an opportunity for Bilbo to call this out in just a moment. But the narrative itself doesn't lean too hard, I think, on the rational absurdity of all of this, the idea that collecting all of these gems, right? Stuffing your pockets with gems is not the same as reclaiming the treasure. And reclaiming the treasure is not the same as reclaiming Erebor, right? Though we should, of course, remember that at this point, reclaiming Erebor is still kind of a secondary goal, not really kind of being acted upon as directly as it is, for example, in the Peter Jackson movies, which does a great job, I think, of anchoring the motivation of Thorin and Company in not just the treasure, but also in the place itself. So we have the collecting of the various treasures as they lifted old treasures from the mound or from the wall and held them in the light, caressing and fingering them, right? We get this idea of, oh my God, remember this? Hey, have you seen this? And once again, we'll recall that everyone but Thorin and Balin is experiencing this for the first time. No other dwarf in this company has been inside Erebor before. They were all born long after Smaug came and destroyed the dwarvish kingdom here. So there is this idea of belonging, and there is this idea of ownership, I suppose, right? This idea that you can just go through and pick things up and caress them and let the gems run through your fingers and take up the harps and start playing your song. I love the detail that the harps, the dark hall was filled with a melody that had long been silent, right? The idea that Fili and Kili here are not bringing a new song to the halls under the mountain, but are instead reigniting, re-sparking, re-enkindling, right? To keep borrowing those Smaugian metaphors, re-enkindling the song that should have been there all this time. I really love how that's inverted from what we might usually expect, right? And then we get that great beat. But most of the dwarves were more practical. They gathered gems and stuffed their pockets. In what way, please tell me, is that more practical than playing music or going through the more conspicuous treasures here in this hoard? They let what they could not carry fall back through their fingers with a sigh. Thorin was not least among these, right? Let us not picture Richard Armitage driven by his desire for the Arkenstone above all else, right? He is also playing with the gems here in the Great Hall, but also looking always for the Arkenstone. And you'll see there too how we are simultaneously kind of emphasizing Thorin's the importance with which Thorin is treating the Arkenstone, and also giving this accounting, a very familiar accounting, we might say, from Bilbo here, right? Though they were much relieved, they were inclined to be grumpy at being frightened for nothing, but what they would have said if he had told them at that moment about the Arkenstone, I don't know. This is another Bilbo stepping out from behind the tree, right, after we've escaped from the Misty Mountains, and just being the best burglar and not telling them the complete truth. He's manifesting again this distance between himself and the dwarves, and there's almost there implicit in the narrative voice the justification. Well, I can't tell them about the Arkenstone now. They're already mad because I scared them, because I dropped my torch, because I was spooked by a bat. Again, kind of really layering in these ideas of tension and of threat, right? Even here, as Fili and Kili, right? We go so quickly from we must move quietly, we must not make any foolish mistakes, to, well, let's just play some songs and kick around, and everyone has a torch and we're all spread out and no one is paying attention, and everything is dangerous. Let us pay a brief moment of attention to Thorin's generosity here too, before we really see him succumb to his own particular version of the dragon sickness. "Mr. Baggins," he cried, "here is the first payment of your reward. Cast off your old coat and put on this." With that, he put on Bilbo a small coat of mail, wrought for some young elf prince long ago. It was of silver steel, which the elves call mithril, and with it went a belt of pearls and crystals. A light helm of figured leather, strengthened beneath with hoops of steel and studded about the brim with white gems, was set upon the hobbit's head. "I feel magnificent," he thought, "but I expect I look rather absurd. How they would laugh on the hill at home. Still, I wish there was a looking glass handy." All the same, Mr. Baggins kept his head more clear of the bewitchment of the hoard than the dwarves did. Long before the dwarves were tired of examining the treasures, he became weary of it and sat down on the floor, and he began to wonder nervously what the end of it all would be. "I would give a good many of these precious goblets," he thought, "for a drink of something cheering out of one of Beorn's wooden bowls." "Thorin!" he cried aloud. "What next? We are armed, but what good has any armor ever been against Smaug the Dreadful? This treasure is not yet won back. We are not looking for gold yet, but for a way of escape, and we have tempted luck too long." The wisdom here of Bilbo Baggins. A few things that I just find completely fascinating. Obviously, yes, this is the lore, right? This is where Bilbo gets his mithril shirt that he will later give to Frodo, that is so instrumental in Frodo's journey during the Lord of the Rings. It's such an important part of Frodo's progress here. And we get, again, right, Took and Baggins both here in this moment. I feel magnificent, but I expect I look rather absurd, right? You can see that hard swing there. The Took voice on one shoulder, the Baggins on the other. "I feel magnificent," says the Took voice. "I look rather absurd," says the Baggins voice. "How they would laugh on the hill at home," says the Baggins voice. "Still, I wish I had a looking glass handy," says the Tookish voice. Yeah, Brian's calling out here, elf prince child. Bilbo's mithril shirt would seem too small for a full-grown elf. It would kind of have to be a child, right? Which is odd because we've noted how the dwarven manufacture, right? We go all the way back to the Misty Mountains Cold song here. We noted in that song how one of the signs of the corruption, the fall of Erebor was the turning away from the outside world to the inside world, right? They stop making things for others. They stop trading with the outside world, and they focus on things of their own make for their own enjoyment. And yeah, I don't know how into that we enfold this idea of a small mithril vest. What is the practicality of it? We learn in The Lord of the Rings that this one vest is worth more than all of the wealth of the Shire. That is what we are told, right? Which I have, for the record, no trouble at all believing. Austin says it's Legolas's hand-me-downs. Exactly, right? But how then would those hand-me-downs return to Erebor? How would they become a part of the hoard again? And what is the practicality of making a mithril shirt for an elf, right? I guess not for an elf, for a child, I suppose is what I'm saying here, right? Children, it is their nature, grow. And I'm curious, do you just, you every fall for the new school season, you have to just craft a new mithril shirt for this kid? I don't know. I'm puzzled by it, and yet I love the fairy tale aspect of it, right? Because let's be clear here, we are not in the operative fantasy world of The Hobbit here. We are back in the fairy tale world of The Hobbit. This is almost definitively a gift from fairy. It is exactly the kind of magical artifact that is gifted to the intrepid hero. The mail shirt that Bilbo receives here is in the same order as the Phial of Galadriel that Frodo receives in The Lord of the Rings, right? It's exactly the same kind of operative mechanism. Austin says, rich people gonna rich. I can't argue with that, Austin. I really can't. I think the world around us does tend to suggest that is in fact the case. And yeah, it's all about having this season's mithril shirt for your kid going off to daycare, right? What a depressing prospect, honestly. So we have, as I say, the brilliant contrast here of the Took and Baggins right here on either one of Bilbo's shoulders. But then we managed to mediate this in a way that we haven't before. I really like how in this moment, as the dwarves are still, enchanted by all of this treasure, all of this gold, all of these jewels, Bilbo, of course, does what he has done before, which is to sit down and kind of feeling a little sorry for himself, think of comfort, think of food, think of drink. But what's so brilliant here is that he doesn't even think of home. He can't make it conceptually, imaginatively, all the way back to Bag End. The Bilbo sitting here in a mithril shirt beneath the deepest chamber of the Lonely Mountain can think of Beorn, right? Which seemed so alien, which seemed so unfamiliar, which seemed so dangerous to him during his first moment there, his first experience of Beorn's house. I'm so curious here about how he is seeing Beorn here in this moment, rather than returning to rather than returning all the way imaginatively to Bag End. Austin is asking, is Thranduil Elon or Bezos or Gates? I am absolutely refusing to get into that. Maybe next week we can hang out at the Green Dragon after the live show. Maybe when I have a whiskey in my hand, I will open the gates to that particular discussion. Chris says, could it actually have been made for a Prince of Dale and never delivered? That does seem more likely. I think it is simply the intrusion here of the narrative voice assuring us that it's for some young elf prince long ago. And the long ago also has that fairy tale aspect, right? Where yes, it could have been for Legolas. I think that is actually completely possible. Is there not? Oh, gosh, I'm having a vague recollection now. Is there some theory that it was like Icthalion or something? Is there some there's some weird connection between this and Gondolin? I don't remember how that works. And Chris is asking, does Bilbo really know? Well, that's very interesting, right? Is this Bilbo's sense of the mithril shirt, or is it the narrative voice, right? We do have this present narrative voice that knows more than Bilbo, but that's a really fair question, Chris. I don't think that we can say with absolute certainty, right? With that, he put on Bilbo a small coat of mail wrought for some young elf prince long ago, or is this Thorin thinking this in this moment, right? It was of silver steel, which the elves call mithril, and with it went a belt of pearls and crystals. No way to really be sure right here. This, I am certain, is one of those things that would have been changed in the 5th phase 1960 revision. It wouldn't have been changed. Let me clarify that thought. Bilbo would absolutely still have received this mithril shirt, but knowing how important it is now in the Legendarium, when Tolkien comes back to The Hobbit to edit it and to modulate it into the tone and into the register of The Lord of the Rings, this is the kind of thing that would have definitely been given an actual history. It would definitely have connected back to something more specific than this. Probably Glorfindel, because we just really love connecting things back to Glorfindel, right? So we get the... Oh, actually, I will say, since I'm talking about revision, I will note, never mind the 1960 revision to The Hobbit, this is the 66 revision, because it isn't until 66 that this vest is explicitly referred to as mithril. Right, the original version, it is silver steel. Even in the second edition, even post The Lord of the Rings, right, we do several revisions there, and it isn't until 1966 and the revisions that Tolkien makes then that this is recast as explicitly mithril. An odd change, honestly, an unnecessary change, I might say, but nonetheless, here we are. So from here, the company listens to Bilbo, listens to his caution, and begin to move through. We get this brilliant beat of the dwarves now all armed and armored, right? Having finally, as I say, geared up. They're now ready for, well, they're not ready for anything, it turns out, but they believe themselves to be more ready than they were before, I'm sure. But they cover all of this armor with their old cloaks again. There's still this tension between the dwarves as a traveling people, and I'm not just talking about the quest here, but I'm talking about the dwarven diaspora, right? These are dwarves without a home. That's part of their hooded cloak kind of costume, right? That is consistent across all of the dwarves that we meet here. And they put those cloaks back on over the armor as though, well, protecting themselves, kind of mediating between these different identities, or possibly hiding away the richness of their new arms and armor. So now we have to confront the question of, what do we do next? Let me see here. Suddenly Bilbo realized that he was not only tired, but also very hungry indeed. It seems to be late morning, he said, and so I suppose it is more or less breakfast time, if there's any breakfast to have, but I don't feel that Smaug's front doorstep is the safest place for a meal. Do let's go somewhere where we can sit quiet for a bit. Quite right, said Balin, and I think I know which way we should go. We ought to make for the old lookout post at the southwest corner of the mountain. How far is that? Asked the Hobbit. 5 hours' march, I should think. It will be rough going. The doors from the gate along the left edge of the stream seems all broken up, but look down there. The river loop runs east across Dale in front of the ruined town. At that point there was once a bridge leading to steep stairs that climbed to the right bank, and so to a road running toward Raven Hill. There is, or was, a path that left the road and climbed up to the post. A hard climb, too, even if the old steps are still there. Dear me, grumbled the Hobbit. More walking and more climbing without breakfast? I wonder how many breakfasts and other meals we may have missed inside that nasty, clockless, timeless hole. So we get something like well, is it too generous to call it a plan? I fear that it might be too generous to call it a plan. I fear that what we get instead is a narrative maneuver. What we want to do is situate the dwarves in such a way that they can, if not witness entirely, at least see the aftermath of what has happened to Smaug. They can learn the truth and we can move the plot into the next phase of its being. But you'll note that in so doing, we are leaving the fairy tale behind and moving into the fantasy realm, right? We are leaving the magical, otherworldly realm of the horde beneath the mountain, and we're now in logistics and politics and geography. We now have roads and bridges and the ruined town of Dale and Ravenhill as an outpost, as a guard post that we can go to. We're transitioning back from magic into a kind of grim and grey-edged reality here, which is necessary for what happens next. As I say, we haven't completely left the fairy tale behind, but that is our last moment, I will say. Our last moment. That is our last true experience of capital F fairy in the pages of The Hobbit. We don't, I think, collectively return there. We have kind of come through this final trial, winning, as is so often the case in classic fairy tales, as is so often the case in monomythic stories, right? If you know your Campbell, you will recognize this process of passing through the darkness, passing under the mountain, and coming out with new magical weapons and armor, right? Not necessarily explicitly magical, but you know, enchanted in some sense. We are now ready for the return to the world, except the world that we are returning to is not a world that we already know. I am running desperately late. So we have this idea here that we're going to continue to pass on. Now we're continuing to think about food. In fact, let's skip ahead and talk directly about the cram. I pulled this very short slide just because I couldn't resist it. After going a short way, they struck the old road and before long came to a deep dell sheltered among the rocks. There they rested for a while and had such breakfast as they could, chiefly cram and water. If you want to know what cram is, I can only say I don't know the recipe, but it is biscuitish, keeps good indefinitely, is supposed to be sustaining, and is certainly not entertaining, being in fact very uninteresting except as a chewing exercise. It was made by the lake man for long journeys. Cram, we are told by Professor Tolkien in the etymologies, is an Elvish word derived from the word for pressed, which implies that it is a compressed biscuit. This, it seems clear, is Tolkien drawing on his knowledge of military rations, which included then and still include today compressed biscuits or compressed cookies, I suppose I should say, here in this fine nation, though I can't imagine Tolkien ever using or indeed sanctioning the use of the word. This comes back to us, of course, when the Fellowship is leaving Lothlorien and Gimli gets into it in The Lord of the Rings. Cram, he said under his breath as he broke off a crisp corner and nibbled at it. His expression quickly changed and he ate all the rest of the cake with relish. No more, no more, cried the elves, laughing. You've eaten enough already for a long day's march. I thought it was only a kind of cram, such as the Dale men make for journeys in the wild, said the dwarf. So it is, they answered, but we call it lembas, or whey bread, and it is more strengthening than any food made by man, and more pleasant than cram by all accounts. Indeed it is, said Gimli. Why, it is better than the honey cakes of the Bjornings, and that is a great praise, for the Bjornings are the best bakers that I know of, but they are none too willing to deal out their cakes to travellers in these days. You are kindly hosts. Which I mentioned in part, right? I pulled that last line of Gimli's in part just for the conspicuous, convenient reference to the Bjornings. Once again, right, as Bilbo was just doing, here we have another character confronted by the memory of cram and drawing the connection back to the Bjornings too. You can find easily online. Had I 5 minutes more time before I had started tonight, I would have just pulled some pictures of compressed biscuits, which function largely as you would expect. And of course, there's so much that we can talk about the difference between the men of the lake and the Lembas of the elves, which is even more special, I think. If you've read your Silmarillion, the Lembas is even more special than we know from the pages of The Lord of the Rings, where it is just like magical elf bread, right? Which is good enough, but perhaps not that fantastic. But then we learn in the pages of the Silmarillion that in fact it is only the queens of the elves who can bake the lembas, who can make this remarkable food, which is, yes, a greater gift than even Gimli knows in that moment. All right, let's get to our last slide of the evening. Let's get to our arrival at the guard post and wrap things up. Here, said Balin, in the old days we used always to keep watchmen, and that door behind leads into a rock-hewn chamber that was made here as a guard room. There were several places like it round the mountain, but there seemed small need for watching in the days of our prosperity, and the guards were made over comfortable, perhaps. Otherwise we might have had longer warning of the coming of the dragon, and things might have been different. Still, Here we can now lie hid and sheltered for a while and see much without being seen. Not much use if we'd been seen coming here, said Dory, who was already looking up toward the mountain's peak as if he expected to see Smaug perched up there like a bird on a steeple. We must take our chance of that, said Thorin. We can go no further today. Here, here, cried Bilbo, and flung himself on the ground. In the rock chamber there would have been room for 100, and there was a small chamber further in, more removed from the cold outside. It was quite deserted. Not even wild animals seemed to have used it in all the days of Smaug's dominion. There they laid their burdens, and some threw themselves down at once and slept, but the others sat near the outer door and discussed their plans. In all their talk they came perpetually back to one thing. Where was Smaug? They looked west, and there was nothing, and east there was nothing, and in the south there were no signs of the dragon, but there was a gathering of very many birds. At that they gazed and wondered, and they were no nearer understanding it when the first cold stars came out. We'll discover next week, of course, what has happened to Smaug, what has happened in the interim, what has befallen Lake Town, and we'll circle back to all of that. And again, a really fascinating narrative maneuver, prioritizing kind of this second thread of the story in a way that we haven't so far through the pages of The Hobbit. I'm interested here in the way that we are, as I say, moving back into the fantasy story and positioning the mountain as a geographically real and realized place, right? It doesn't work like the halls of Thranduil, where we get a vague sense impression of how everything works, right? We don't really know the layout or the size or the scale of Thranduil's halls, even though Bilbo is actively performing reconnaissance through those halls for weeks at a time. Here, though, we're really getting the sense of the mountain as a real place, which is, of course, narratively necessary. That's why we're doing it. But the effect of that realization is, as I say, the movement away from fairy tale and into this fantasy that is underpinned by a fully developed and realized secondary world, a world of logistics and of detail and of military provision, right? The idea that they should have had guardsmen up here, and the idea that they then made these guardsmen too comfortable, and that leads to... Oh, I meant to call this out earlier, in fact. The armor that the dwarves take off of the walls, the fact that there are things on the walls in the Great Hall, in and amidst Smaug's hoard, I do not take this to be a suggestion that Smaug has hung these things on the walls himself, you understand. I think that the armor that the dwarves have taken was hung on the walls, perhaps not as ornamental armor, but just in reserve. One of the things that is emphasized here, which kind of is clear right from the beginning of the story, right from the Misty Mountains Cold Song, right? We get the sense that Smaug descends upon Erebor all at once, and it is a calamity, right? It is just a catastrophe happening, rather than any kind of prolonged conflict or battle even. It is just a awful, tumultuous thing that happens immediately. But here we get that doubled back to, right? We get this idea that if there had been more guards, if the dwarves of Erebor hadn't become complacent, if they hadn't become lazy, I hesitate even to say that, but you know what I mean, right? If they hadn't become less observant than they would otherwise be, then they would have had more time, they would have had more warning, and Smaug's assault might not have been so disastrous, right? There's no real way of knowing whether or not even the prepared might of Erebor could have stood against Smaug, but perhaps more could have escaped, perhaps more could have been done. We don't know for sure. Brian's saying, this reminds me of Tolkien moving back and forth between the narrative threads in The Lord of the Rings after the Fellowship is broken. Absolutely, Brian. You're completely correct. This is very Two Towers, right? We're getting these different simultaneous narrative strands, and not even simultaneous narrative strands, because we are more than happy, as we're doing here, to reset by a couple of days and kind of catch up with the timeline that we previously established. We do that all over the place, as we were discussing during our long journey through the Two Towers back in there and back again. All right, that I think is going to do it. Let's take a quick look at our schedule for next week, because yes, as Brian's calling out here, we will get the story of what has happened next week in just a barnstormer of a chapter. November 18th, chapter 14, Fire and Water. The following week, we're going to be looking at the Gathering of the Clouds, and the story is just not going to take its foot off the gas from this point all the way to the end. We are going to continue to add complexity and nuance and realism and naturalism, and we're going to continue to drive these characters harder and harder still, and come to breaking points, and ultimately we will crash into the finale of this book and some of my favorite moments in all of Tolkien's writing. So all of that still lays ahead. I hope you will stick with me through next week's reading, through chapter 15 and all the way to the end of the book at the end of the year. It has been, you guys, an absolute pleasure. I can't believe this hour has passed so quickly. This has been enormous fun. As I said at the beginning of the show tonight, stay tuned. No bonus episode this week because I have to go and work on the other episode that I'm about to release. But a new episode of Shire Reckoning will be in your podcast feeds within the hour as of this live recording. And then if you're listening to this in the podcast form, just know that once deep in the night, a man worked at his computer sending out podcasts to an uncaring world. Not an uncaring world, but, a sleeping world mostly. That is going to do it for this week. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you so much for hanging out. To Austin and to Brian and to Hugh and to Chris, it's been so great to have you all here this week. I hope to see you next week for Fire and Water. Until then, Aure and Taluva. Good night, all.